Incompleteness is part of a series. So this is the Norton series on great scientific discoveries. And the two editors, James Atlas and Jesse Cohn, had approached me. They just wanted me to do a book for them. And the idea behind the series was to get people who really know how to write. So they didn't go to a mathematician or to a logician, and they tended to go to people who have a great love for, interest in, have studied these subjects, but it wasn't the usual suspects that they went to. And they simply came and asked me, whom I would want to write about. And, immediately Kurt Gödel came to mind. I'm a philosopher. I'm a novelist, but I'm trained in philosophy. My doctorate's in philosophy. I've taught philosophy for most of my life. And Gödel's theorems, they inhabit both mathematics and philosophy. It's very, very unusual that they're this kind of crossover, that they are philosophical theorems that have great philosophical implications. One argues about what the implications are, but that they have implications seems pretty clear. And he certainly thought they had philosophical implications. He thought of himself as a philosopher. Of all mathematical results, though, this is the one that I felt that I was perhaps more competent to deal with because I have I'm a professional philosopher. Secondly, I actually had met Gödel very briefly when I was a graduate student. I speak about it ever so briefly towards the end of Incompleteness. He was notoriously reclusive, almost a hermit. It was when I was a graduate student at Princeton Philosophy Department. He was the reigning god. Einstein was long dead by that time, but Gödel was, our genius, and we had all sorts of, when we would get together for parties, and not just graduate students, but professors as well, mathematicians, physicists, we often traded stories about Gödel. I mean, it was having this legend living right there, and a reclusive legend that we never saw. And I went to a party at the Institute for Advanced Study, and it was a party for welcoming newcomers, and Gödel was there. There was this brief window in which he was sociable, he was gregarious. And, when I, doing research for the book, and I spoke to people who knew him and said, yes, there were, 3-4 months when he came out into the world. And I was just lucky that it happened to be at this party, and there he was holding court. And we were all, young people, we were all standing around him. And after he left, he was very gracious and courtly and old world and wished us all well. And after he left, we all said, God, I wish I had asked him this, I wish I had asked him that. And my whole life, there was one question I had wanted to ask him and didn't. So, but so there it was, so our paths very briefly crossed. And third, I'm also a novelist. I'm primarily nowadays a novelist. And Gödel is this kind of character I could have created. I mean, that sounds almost arrogant, but it's just the kind of improbable and inconsistent personality that I love to explore in my fiction. Somebody who is kind of a hero in the world of thought. I mean, and brave and risk-taking. He went where no man or woman had ever gone before. He went completely against the tide. He brought down formalism, according to himself and some others not. I mean, here's where the philosophical implications get murky. But he was a voyager and a hero. And in his personal life, he was pathetic. He was clueless. He was prey to delusions. He was paranoid. He was not heroic at all in his personal life. And that kind of contradiction, especially in a logician, right? Everybody called him the successor to Aristotle. So here he is, this most the greatest logician since Aristotle, but so, in some sense irrational, was killed because of his paranoid delusions, thought people were poisoning him, and so ended up starving to death. I mean, that kind of inconsistency, which to me is so poignant. To me, it speaks to the whole human dilemma, that we can be in some ways so developed and so brilliant, and in other ways so pathetic. That's exactly what I always try to get at in my fiction. And so he's just the kind of character I would want to inhabit and understand. And in some sense, I often have thought maybe that brief crossing of our lives, and my own obsession with him when I was a graduate student, to a certain extent motivated my fiction, that I've always been interested in the helpless genius. The first Incompleteness Theorem states that there are true propositions that within a formal system, which has to be defined very carefully, within a formal system which is also consistent and which is rich enough to express arithmetic, most basic mathematics, with those three conditions, a formal system, consistency, rich enough to express arithmetic, there will be propositions that we can express and which are true, but they can't be proved within that formal system. We can actually see that they're true, and the proof gives us a way of seeing they're true, but we're not seeing that they're true by proving them within the formal system. So that's the first Incompleteness Theorem. Within every consistent formal system rich enough to express arithmetic, there are true but unprovable propositions. And the second Incompleteness Theorem is that one of the things that you can't prove within a consistent formal system is the consistency of that system. So you can't, within that system, prove that the system is consistent. And that's the second Incompleteness Theorem. By providing a model for the system, saying this system describes this set of things. The system is about, for example, numbers. You can give a model theoretical proof for the consistency of the system. But to specify a model is to go outside the strict proof theoretic system. And it is, in fact, to say that the system is about something. And that is precisely what the formalists wanted to say wasn't true. So the only way to say that the system is consistent is to say, well, it's about something. It's about numbers, for example. Specify a domain that it's describing. The system itself is inadequate to prove its own consistency, and it's inadequate to prove all the true propositions that you can express within the system. So the system, that purely formal system, seems to be inadequate for doing some things. For people who wanted to reduce all of mathematics to formal systems, formalism, that was a problem. And so that's why it has all of these implications, because the big issue in mathematics is, what is it we're doing when we're doing mathematics, right? What is it? What is this about? And it's always baffled us. It's our most certain domain. It's the only place where we can actually prove things, and prove really interesting things, prove things that surprise us, prove things about infinity, and we can actually get our little finite hands on infinity. It's so powerful, and it's certain, and it's conclusive. But what are we doing when we're doing it? Are we describing something? Are we making up a game and following rules, and that's just a higher form of chess? The whole question of what is it that we're doing mathematics, that belongs to the philosophy of mathematics. And Gödel's Incompleteness Theorems may or may not have something to do with what it is that we're doing when we're doing mathematics. The most important mathematician of the previous generation, before Gödel, was David Hilbert. And he was a formalist. And he was interested in this question of what is it we're doing when we're doing mathematics. And basically he's saying, look, we create these formal systems. They are transparent. We know exactly what we're doing. We lay down these rules, we lay down these axioms, kind of stipulate them, and it's a kind of game, and then we see what follows. And it's not some independent reality that we're discovering, just as we're not discovering a chess reality when we play chess, but we're just seeing the implications of these stipulated rules. And that is the great value of dispelling the mystery. I mean, it's a very pleasing answer to what is it that we're doing when we're doing mathematics. It makes it really kind of understandable. And there were certain things that had to be proved, and that David Hilbert said we must prove in order for this Hilbert program, this formalist program, to go forward. And one of the things was the consistency, to be able to prove within a formal system the consistency of arithmetic. And that's why Gödel's second Incompleteness Theorem, really sort of sent a shock through the mathematical world. He was saying that can't be done. But the formalists basically were saying, what is it that we're doing? We're doing mathematics. We are creating formal systems and seeing the implications. And that, it's not that there are no formalists. I don't want to make it sound as if Gödel, just sort of drove formalism into its grave, although some people do talk that way. I don't feel competent to say that. I think things are murky. But he made it harder to be a formalist. You have to dance around a lot post-Gödel in the way that you didn't have to before Gödel. The first thing he proved, now let me just go back a little bit. He was very interested in philosophy. As an undergraduate, he first thought he might major in philosophy, and then he thought he would go into physics, but I think it was when he took a philosophy course and he became a Platonist, somebody who believes abstract ideas really exist, and so mathematical reality really exists. And what are we doing when we're doing mathematics? We're discovering this extra spatio-temporal, non-physical, abstract, beautiful, perfect, eternal world. Great appeal to him as an undergraduate. First thought he was going to go into number theory. He formed this audacious ambition to prove something mathematically that would vindicate this philosophical view of Platonism. I mean, that's like audacious. Nobody's ever done this. And he decided he was going to do this. He first thought he would go into number theory, that would be the place to do it. Sometime he decided, and we don't know when, because he was a very, very private, reticent man, that he was going to go into logic, that was going to do it. Logic was a kind of iffy, sketchy field of mathematics at that point. A lot of mathematicians didn't take it terribly seriously. It was too close to philosophy. He developed mathematical logic, so it's now taught in branches, in departments of math before it was portioned to the philosophy departments. So sometime when he was an undergraduate, he had an inkling that logic could do this. As a graduate student, his dissertation, what he proved was the completeness of predicate calculus, which is not as strong enough to express arithmetic. That's a formal system you can't express arithmetic in. At some point, we don't know when, he came up with this proof for the incompleteness of a formal system rich enough to express arithmetic. The first inkling came was he was at a conference on Königsberg, the same city Kant lived in all his life. And it was a conference on the foundations of mathematics, and all of the favorite competing groups were represented there. Not Platonism, because nobody took Platonism seriously at that point. There was somebody who represented formalism. Hilbert wasn't there, but Johann von Neumann, the great Johann von Neumann, had come in from Princeton. He was originally Hungarian. He was there, and others, but, and sort of arguing this out. Gödel, I think, gave some little talk, nothing, he didn't talk about it. Then the third day, I believe it was the third day, when they were sort of rehashing what had been done, the general discussion, what had been done during the conference, Gödel said, and this was the announcement, right? He said, it took maybe 30 seconds, and I would imagine that he mumbled it. It might be possible to be able to form an arithmetical proposition on the order of Goldbach's conjecture, a very famous unsolved problem, still unsolved, that we can show is true but not provable. And we might be able to have a formal proof for that. And nobody paid any attention to it. You know, it was just, you know how when you're all talking about one thing and somebody, you know, it's just totally on another wavelength, you just don't even hear it. You just, you know, it's just, and he's just a graduate student. Well, what happened was and who knows what he would have done if this had not happened. Would he have ever published? I don't know, who knows. But Johnny von Neumann was there, and he buttonholed him afterwards. He said, were you saying what I thought you were saying? You know, and he questioned him about this, and Gödel gave him the outlines of the proof. He gave him something. Von Neumann went back to Princeton, thought a little bit more, wrote back to Gödel and said, you know, an implication, it seems to me, if what you're saying is right, an implication would be that we can't prove the consistency of arithmetic within the formal system of arithmetic. And Gödel wrote back and he said, indeed, yes. And he had, of course, the whole worked out proof. And it was von Neumann who had paid attention to this, who had caught it, even though it went completely against what he believed. He was representing Hilbert there. He was a complete formalist. But von Neumann was fantastic, amazing. And he got it. And he's the one who publicized it and talked about it. Eventually brought Gödel over to Princeton, where he, you know, spent the rest of his life. But that's how it was made. And it's just so typical, characteristic of this strange man. A man named John Lucas, a philosopher, had published in the early 60s, maybe I think 1962, a paper claiming basically the kernel of what Roger Penrose would go on and develop in 2 books, The Emperor's New Mind and I can't remember the second, Shadows of Consciousness, or I can't remember the second book. Basically, he had argued this. He said the implications of Gödel's incompleteness is that our minds can't be computers. We can't be digital computers in any case, because the one place where you would think perhaps we're being computers isn't in knowing mathematics. I mean, forget, you know, writing novels and writing poetry and music. But I mean, the one place where you would think where really a computer could duplicate what we're doing would be in mathematics. He's saying, but Gödel has shown that that isn't the case. Computers run on formal systems. That's what that a computer is, a formal system made physical. And in fact, you know, some people claim that because of Gödel, the work that Gödel did, and then Alan Turing, an English logician who took off from Gödel's work and did another theorem on undecidability, the computer, especially because of Turing, the computer was actually developed out of these logicians' work because they made clear precisely what a formal system is. By showing the limitations of a formal system, that it can prove everything, that there will always be things that we can know that escape a formal system. They made the notion of a formal system clearer, and we needed that to create computers. But in any case, how the argument goes is by showing clearly what a formal system is and showing that there are certain truths that we know, that we can always see, and we can see are eluding the formal system, we can't be a computer. A computer couldn't duplicate what we're doing. A computer running on a formal system can't duplicate what we're doing. That's basically how the argument goes. I think it's quite persuasive. I wish I had asked Gödel what he thought of John Lucas's work, and it's bothered me, the last 30, 40, I mean, however many years it's been. I guess not that many. It's been many decades, and it's bothered me that I never have. He spoke a great deal to a logician named Hao Wang, and Hao Wang, who was at Rockefeller University, used to come in and speak to Gödel, and Hao Wang published quite a few books, at least 3 that I can think of right now, on his conversations with Gödel. And so much of what we know, those of us who didn't have the opportunity or weren't brave enough to ask him when we were with him, you could go to Hao Wang. And so there is a place in which, Hao Wang does ask him about this. And it's fascinating what Gödel says. He said, if we really have the mathematical knowledge that we have, that we think we have rather, but we may be deluded about it, but if we really do, then we can't be computers. So it's a sort of disjunctive proposition. He's not saying we're not computers, but he is saying that we might be deluded computers with delusions of grandeur, who think that we know things that we really don't, that we can't prove. And in that case, you know, we are computers. We're just deluded computers. And that also, I think, is just so interesting, given that he, in fact, suffered from paranoia, from very severe paranoia. What he's sort of worrying is that we may be paranoid computers. And if you are, we could never discover that. And that, of course, is one of the great tragedies about paranoia. You never, if you're going through a proof that you're not paranoid, but the whole proof is infected with your mental illness, the proof is no good, right? It's infected as well. So that, you know, that even that answer somehow is poignant in the context of his story. But that's the answer that he gives. Ernest Nagel was a philosopher of science. He was my professor when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, and and it goes into, I give a very, very impressionistic version of the proof, you know, enough so you can get the flavor of it. And they give, you know, really far more detail. So that is a wonderful place to go to understand the proof. The proof itself is extraordinarily dense. I had studied the paper itself when I was a graduate student, and then, you know, left it and, you know, did other things. And then when I decided I would write this book, you know, I had to go back and re-immerse myself in all of that. And that was itself very, you know, painful, because I had to work so hard to recover, having been away from it for so long. But it's a very, very dense paper, and so many things fall out from it. He makes logic mathematically respectable. He puts it, you know, he really puts it on the map as a genuine, respectable mathematical branch. And so there's recursion theory. He defines what a recursive function is. Recursion theory comes out of there. Model theory, proof theory. So much has come out of that incredibly dense, brilliant paper. So von Neumann was talking up, you know, this extraordinary work, and comes as a guest. I ought to say that, you know, this was a time of great upheaval in Austria, where he lived. He was in Vienna, University of Vienna. Hitler had come to power. Gödel wasn't Jewish, which is worth saying, actually, because everybody thinks he was. And even Bertrand Russell writes, because, you know, Bertrand Russell, when he came to the States, he came to Princeton, and he had discussions with Gödel, and he writes about these expatriates, these immigrants, and, you know, the Austrian Jew Gödel, and then I think Gödel said, oh, you know, he says, just for the sake of truth, I'm going to correct Bertrand Russell. I happen not to be Jewish, you know, it's not that, it doesn't matter one way or the other, but that's interesting. The reason his group in Vienna had been associated with a group of the Vienna Circle of logical positivists. He was not a positivist, he was very anti-positivistic, but he did associate with them. I think there were about 15, and 9 of them were Jewish, and his dissertation, Hans Hahn, his dissertation advisor was Jewish, and so he did associate with many Jews, and he kind of looked Jewish. And he was beaten up in Vienna by the brown shirts, who took it for granted, as Bertrand Russell did, that he was Jewish. And his wife, his redoubtable wife, fought the brown shirts off with an umbrella. But he did want to leave. They had recently bought and refurbished an apartment in Vienna, but he did want to leave. And it was hard to get him out. The director of the Institute and von Neumann had to work very hard to get him out. He had never joined the Nazi Party, but he was not a protest. He was very, very apolitical. But they managed to get him to come. He came very, very long way. I think first he sailed to San Francisco, and then they made their way overland, and then he finally did come to the Institute and remained there pretty much for the rest of his life. So another very important thing that he did is there's another There's a hypothesis called the Continuum Hypothesis. It's a hypothesis in set theory. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into. He contributed to a very important conclusion, which is that the Continuum Hypothesis can't be proved given our set theory, the current system of set theory. So here is a proposition that was unprovable. It's either true or it's false, and we can't prove it. And he contributed 1/2 of the proof that the Continuum Hypothesis is unprovable. He showed that it is consistent with the axioms of set theory, and its negation is consistent with the axioms of set theory. So both the Continuum Hypothesis and its negation are consistent with the axioms of set theory. Therefore, you can't prove it. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it. And he did 1/2 of it, I think, proving that the negation of it was consistent, and Paul Kohn, a great logician, did the other 1/2 of it. And that's another very important result. But here's the thing about Gödel. He only was interested in mathematics for the philosophy. That's very, very odd. I mean, this great mathematician who could see so much, but he thought of himself as primarily a philosopher. And he was interested only in doing mathematics that was going to have philosophical implications. So he set the bar extraordinarily high. And he did think of himself as a failure. We see in Hao Wang's many interviews with him, because he judged himself not in regard to other mathematicians, but by Plato, Leibniz, Descartes. He wanted something that would completely change our philosophical view of the world. And judged by those lights, he considered himself a failure, but also he was only looking for mathematics that could do that, you see. So that's very, very difficult to find. I mean, it's amazing he found it at all. Right? But this was an unusual sort of mathematician. When I was doing the research for the book, I went to the Institute and spoke to mathematicians who were there, which was fascinating. They've all since died. I got them just at the nick of time, They told me stories about watching these two walking back and forth. Every morning, every evening, they would go together. I think they would walk home together. And I reproduced some pictures in the book of them walking across the field at the Institute. They were both refugees from the Nazi terror. Einstein was Jewish, German, got out. And Einstein actually said, towards the end of his life, he said the end of Einstein's life, he was working on the unified field theory and things were not coming out. He was kind of a little marginalized from the community of physicists. And he said that his own work doesn't mean all that much to him anymore. He wrote this in German. I go to the office each day to have the privilege to walk home with Gödel. So it was a very, very important relationship for both of them, certainly for Gödel. I mentioned before that Gödel was interested in mathematics that intersected with philosophy, and that he put the bar very high for himself. Einstein was also a philosopher physicist. He was also interested in the philosophical implications of his physics, the nature of time, the nature of space, the nature of reality. Both men held points of view that were quite oppositional to the reigning philosophical point of view, to the Weltanschauung of their time. They were both very anti-positivist. They both believed that their fields were descriptive. Einstein believed that physics, abstract physics, theoretical physics, describes an external world out there. It's not just a matter of our experiences, it's not just making predictions of our experiences, that his theory, and relativity theory in particular, is giving us the mathematical structure of reality. This went quite against the grain because of the various problems in quantum mechanics. Some of the most popular interpretation of why we get the weirdness in quantum mechanics is it's not describing anything objectively real. It's just predictive of our experiences. And this is so Einstein, we all know, it's part of the whole legend, rejected quantum mechanics, it wasn't just that he didn't like probability, the stochastic nature. It wasn't just that God doesn't play dice with the world. It was big. It was this whole notion that in order to save the quantum phenomena, if to save this theory, we have to do away with external reality, the hell with the theory. That was basically, I mean, he saw physics as descriptive of reality. So a deep realist about his subject. Gödel was a deep realist about mathematics as well. He was, that mathematics is descriptive of what's real. Our formal systems can't capture everything because truth is too big for our formal systems. The truth is out there. Both of them believe the truth is out there. And what fired them up in their fields was this, that we have access through these fields to go beyond our own experience, to get access to objective reality. So they were both, there was a deep philosophical affinity between the two of them. And so people said to me, I remember Amon Borel, a mathematician who had been at the Institute, said, we all wondered, what did they talk about? What did these two talk about watching them go? And he said to me, they only wanted to talk to each other. They didn't want to talk to anybody else. Gödel was a young man. Einstein was an old and disappointed man. When Einstein died, you can say that Gödel lost the only person he really wanted to talk to. He had his wife, but he didn't talk to her about philosophy or objective reality or mathematics. That wasn't her role. That wasn't the kind of marriage that they had. And he really stopped talking to people. And it was amazing when I spoke to people who had been his colleagues there, the mathematicians, how I got a sense of how isolated he was. They were mathematicians, they weren't logicians. Some of them still had that prejudice. I mean, somebody said to me, I won't say who, said to me, oh, the man, I was surprised when I started to talk to him. He knew mathematics. He did know his mathematics. He wasn't only a logician. I mean, just to say that seemed to me, I could sense what he had to overcome. And he was an odd man. He was a stickler for rules. He drove them crazy. And then finally, the big thing at the Institute is the appointments, the permanent appointments. You have the temporary visitors at the Institute for Advanced Study, and you have the permanent. And to be a permanent visitor is like, okay, you've arrived on Mount Olympus, you are a god, this is it. So they take it extremely, extremely seriously. So and it can often be quite, I don't want to say violent, but the discussions can be very heated about who gets to be a god or goddess and who not. And apparently, Gödel could be such a stickler and so obstinate that finally they decided to make him a department of one. He was no longer in the mathematics department. He was in the logic department. He was the only logician. And he didn't read the folders of the people who were applying to the Institute. He had no part of this anymore. And that's how they solved their problem. But, it meant he was all the more isolated and all the more, I guess, free to indulge in these terrible paranoid delusions, that eventually killed him. So when he lost Einstein, he lost a lot. He really lost his tie to the world of people, it seems. And Einstein was very amused by him. And also people say they were such different kinds of people because Einstein was so down to earth and funny and full of common sense, and Gödel had no common sense. He was just a very, he had very strange views all over the place. And there's this one story where this guy meets Einstein, and Einstein said, oh, this is in the 1950s, Einstein died, 1954? He said, Gödel, he's completely lost it. He's completely crazy now. And the guy says, oh, what did he do now? He said, he voted for Eisenhower. He voted for Eisenhower for president. And so, there was this, they were just very different kinds of people. But it's poignant, I think. Philosophically, very close. He had suffered from paranoia even when he was still in Vienna. He had been in an asylum for a while. One of the professors, the mathematicians, who had been one of his professors, Furtwängler, I think, he said, is it in the nature of the work that makes him mentally unstable, or must you be mentally unstable in order to do this kind of work? So there had been instability before of a kind of paranoid nature. When he lost Einstein and became really a very lonely man, a very isolated man who saw his theorems being misused. This was an interesting thing. He felt that his theorems were not understood the way that mathematically everybody understood them, but the philosophy that he was trying to argue for behind it, he saw that the exact opposite conclusions were often drawn. So that instead of saying, people saying we have mathematical knowledge that goes beyond the formal system, that people often interpret as, oh, we don't have this mathematical knowledge, everything is uncertain, everything is, it's all, even mathematics is uncertain. He wasn't saying anything like that. And so, and this could feed into his paranoid delusions, and he decided there was a kind of conspiracy to keep people stupid. Like we used to say in the 60s, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not after you. And that was kind of, true with Gödel, and he felt, it fed into the delusions that he didn't like the way his theorems were being used, and he still disliked positivism very much, logical positivism very much, and always protested loudly when his theorems were seen in that context. So the interesting thing is, the thinker he felt closest to was Leibniz, who was a 17th century rationalist who also believed that sort of everything can be deduced through a priori reason. And he felt very, very close. After Einstein died, that was his closest contact with somebody who had died, 300 years before he was born. And he had actually thought that Einstein's work, that had been, people had connived to hide some of his basic work. I mean, it all fed into this kind of delusion. And people who knew him, I can't think of his name right now. Is it Morgan Thau? I can't think of it right now. But he knew him back from Vienna, and he was sort of somewhat involved in his life. And he writes with tremendous pain. He himself was dying of cancer very painfully, but he's saying it's such a burden on me. I'm one of his few ties to the world of people. And then and he died, and he was just a very lonely man. And I did a little research on paranoia, when I was trying to understand him. A very classic symptom is the delusion that people are trying to poison you. And he had always been very fastidious about his food, and the delusions were often involved with poison gases from the refrigerator, poison food. And his wife had to go, she would taste his food for him. She had to go into the hospital for her own surgery, and while she was away, he just shriveled away into nothing. How long his wife had roasted a chicken, and he came from New York, from Rockefeller, to bring Gödel the chicken, and Gödel wouldn't open the door to How Long, this one person who he had trusted and given all these interviews to, and How Long certainly worshipped. How Long, an important logician in his own right, worshipped Gödel. He stared out from the door. He wouldn't open the door, so How Long finally just left the chicken, on the doorstep and went away. By the time that Gödel's wife came home, they got him into the hospital. He was 75 pounds, and he died of starvation. So it's tragic and it's sad. One psychiatrist whom I consulted said that in some sense, paranoia is like logic run amok. There's a reason for everything. And Gödel always thought there was always a reason for everything. Leibniz says this, but he wasn't paranoid. There's a way to interpret this, so it's just rationalism. It's just 17th century rationalism. But it somehow bled into and it reinforced his own unstable mentality. And so when he saw reasons for everything, he saw conspiracies, he saw plots, he saw human machinations. And so it was partly this kind of intellectual viewpoint, but then it intersected with his own mental weaknesses, and it was tragic. But it's an extraordinary story, and we have this beautiful, beautiful proof, one of the most beautiful proofs to actually get a feel for it. People always talk about beauty in mathematics, and outsiders, how can math be beautiful? This is an example of something where when you get to the certain point where he actually brings everything together, your heart stops. It really is heart-stoppingly beautiful, and it seems a little bit like sleight of hand, like magic. How did he make all of this come about? So it's an extraordinary proof, and he's left us that. So this is my book, and it's called Incompleteness, The Proof and Paradox of Kurt Gödel. It was in a series, the Norton series on great scientific discoveries, and it's about a mathematical logician named Kurt Gödel, who proved when he was very, very young two very important, perhaps the most important mathematical theorems of the last 100 years.